Pro-life talk. Real world answers. This is Life Report.
Welcome to Life Report. I am your host, Josh Braun. We're here with the president of Life Training Institute, Scott Klusendorf, and the executive director of Fresno Right to Life, Jonathan Keller, and former co-host of Life Report.
Yes, way back when.
It's been a long time. It's good to have you back in studio. And what our audience is gonna get to see or hear today is a nice in-house debate between two professional pro-lifers on probably the most important topic for pro-lifers to be discussing and thinking carefully about in 2012, which is voting principles. So we're going to get to hear these guys talk about, this is kind of the question that we're asking here, and I'm hoping there's at least a little bit of disagreement, because I know there's a lot of disagreement outside the studio. I want to hear a dialogue on these ideas so people can be thinking about them, because these issues, elections have consequences, and we need to be talking about this. So here's the question that we're talking about. Should pro-lifers always vote for the most pro-life candidate? Here's what I want to do. Scott, let's start with you. You've written on this before. You've been pretty public on this topic. So why don't you just kind of summarize your case, and then we're going to let John respond. Should pro-lifers always vote for the most pro-life candidate?
Well, let's start by defining what do we mean by voting pro-life, and what is the ultimate goal we're aiming for here. We've got to answer that. But before we answer those two questions, we need to be clear about the current reality we're in. The current reality right now is the federal courts have co-opted the abortion issue from the legislative and executive branches and given them no say on this issue. Right. That's the legal reality we're in, which means abortion is legal for any reason or no reason through all 9 months of pregnancy. The political reality in front of us is you have one major party, the Democrat Party, that is committed to abortion wholesale. In other words, they never saw an abortion they didn't like. Right. And if you doubt that, just look at the most recent HHS mandate.
Yeah.
The other party doesn't do as good a job as we'd like opposing abortion, but as Greg Kokel has aptly pointed out, given a choice between a first-class arsonist and a second-class fireman, you're going to go with the second-class fireman. So there's the background to this question. Now, here, let me answer the first thing I raised. What does it mean to vote pro-life? And here's my answer. Voting pro-life does not mean voting for the most pro-life candidate. It means voting in such a way that you save the most number of lives possible, given the political and legal realities confronting you. That the principle we're aiming at, the objective principle we're aiming at, is the saving of lives. And could there be such a world where voting for a candidate who is less than pro-life is actually the better pro-life vote? And I would argue that yes, there is such a world where that could be the case, and often is the case, because at the legislative level, not the executive level, but at the legislative level, parties determine political philosophy and policies, not individuals. When you've got one party, the Democrat Party, where overwhelmingly its members support abortion on demand and want to force religious organizations to be complicit in it, the few number of pro-life, quote, pro-life members of that party will have zero influence on the majority position of that party. So now let's look at it where it comes to the road. You've got a congressional election in front of you. You've got a Republican running over here that is marginally pro-life, but he's actually pretty lousy on the issue. Let's make this even more interesting. He's actually pro-abortion, and he's running against a pro-life Democrat. You cast your vote for the pro-life Democrat. Have you really cast a pro-life vote? I would argue no. Because the only way that pro-life Democrat will ever have a chance to vote on a real pro-life bill is if his party is not in power. Right. And by the way, the most important pro-life vote that pro-life Democrat will cast is for control of the Speaker's chair. Right. Every one of the so-called pro-life Democrats in Congress prior to Obamacare voted for Nancy Pelosi to be the Speaker, which set in stone that we would have a rabidly pro-abortion agenda rammed down our throat. So when it really mattered for them to vote pro-life, they didn't deliver. when I vote for the pro-abortion Republican, I'm casting, at least as the way things currently are configured, and this is contingent on the two parties remaining as I described them a moment ago.
Okay.
When I cast a vote for that pro-abortion Republican, I'm not voting for him. I don't vote for him because I intend to be party to his evil. I vote for him to prevent an even greater evil, the Democrat Party getting control of Congress and ramming pro-abortion legislation down our throat. Now, at the executive level, that starts to look a little different. Let's say we had a pro-life Democrat running against a pro-abortion Republican. Now that's a different story because the president does something individually and is not as tied to the party situation as the individual member of Congress. So when you say, is it always right to vote for the most pro-life candidate, we need to define what we mean by those terms.
John.
Yes. Well, first off, I'm really glad to have Scott here. I would actually agree, I think, with a lot of what Scott says. I think it's been, historically, that's certainly been the case, where we've seen really a lot of parties be the primary drivers of the political discourse. The thing that's been really interesting for me to watch in the last few years has been to see some really, especially since President Obama has been elected, but even going back to 2006, we've seen some really kind of wacky and weird House and Senate races. I think I would agree in general with the thrust of what you're saying. But I think it's also important sometimes to examine some of the nuance behind that. I certainly am not one of those people that would say, you want to vote, especially in a general election, that you always want to vote for the quote-unquote most pro-life candidate. I think that you do have to draw a distinction, like you said, between the executive branch and the legislative branch. I also think sometimes you may have to even draw a distinction between the House and the Senate, because the difference is that obviously with the House, the person who is elected as Speaker is the person who receives the most number of votes. I can definitely understand that in that situation, most of the time, it's going to be the person who is the most even if the person is not the most pro-life, you'd want to be able to vote for the, let's say in this case, the Republican, the member of the predominantly pro-life party, because they're going to cast a vote for a Republican, presumably pro-life Speaker of the House. The interesting thing, though, there was a couple of races in the last few years that have made me kind of question, maybe not necessarily voting for a pro-life Democrat, but I know this is going to be maybe even worse than saying voting for a pro-life Democrat, but considering voting for a third-party candidate. Now, I know I'm getting scared looks from Josh. But
I've done a speech on this. I'm ready. No, go ahead.
The interesting thing, though, that's the example actually that I've heard is if any of you are familiar with in 2009, I believe it was a congressional race in New York. It was the New York 23rd Congressional District.
Right.
And I'm sure you're very familiar with it. There was a vacancy that was created. President Obama appointed someone to, I believe, be the Secretary of the Army. And as a result, there was, and remarkably, President Obama appointed a Republican to be the Secretary of the Army. And there was an opening for Congress. And the Republican Party of New York in that area selected a former small-town mayor named Didi Skozafava. Right. And she was in the New York legislature, the state legislature. She was radically pro-abortion. I mean, seriously pro-abortion. And as you can imagine, this district that she was in, even though it's New York, the district she was in was actually fairly conservative. And what happened was the Conservative Party in New York decided to run a candidate named, I believe it was Doug Hoffman. And he was very pro-life. He actually was not a professional politician at all. He was a CPA. And actually, if you look back, that's kind of one of the hallmarks of kind of the starting of the Tea Party movement, in my view. It was one of the first kind of key indicators where you had a lot of conservative columnists, conservative pundits that were saying, this lady is absolutely, wholly unacceptable. Now, maybe she might be acceptable if it was a liberal district and if the liberals had voted to select her as the nominee. In that situation, it's kind of like, well, she's probably going to vote for, a Republican Speaker of the House. So what are you going to do? In that case, if it was normal circumstances, I would probably agree with you. But in this case, the conservative candidate came within a fraction of percentage points of coming and winning that election.
Yeah.
The interesting thing was about this particular case was they had a three-way debate with Skozafava and then the Democrat and then Doug Hoffman, the conservative. The conservative was getting tons of support from traditional Republican voters.
Right.
And so much support, in fact, that Dee Skozafava, 2 days before the Republican election, she dropped out of the race. And she said, I just can't win. I'm not getting enough support. So she dropped out. So naturally, what one would think is all of her support would transfer to the conservative until the day after she dropped out, pro-abortion Republican nominee endorsed the Democrat who was running for that congressional district.
Yeah.
And my concern is that in a situation like that, even though obviously the conservative is not a member of the Republican Party, I think it's pretty clear that he was probably going to vote to elect a conservative Speaker of the House. So I think that obviously that's kind of an outlier. That's one district out of 435 congressional districts. But I think that there, in the last few years, with some of the things that have been happening with the Tea Party in particular, I think that that actually may become more common in certain situations. And I think the thing that people have to look at is examining some of these races carefully to determine what the best situation is. And the other example that has come up recently was in Alaska. And this is the thing that's so frustrating to me that just makes me very, I'm sure it makes you upset as well. I think a lot of times as pro-lifers, we are willing to even compromise our beliefs to a certain degree. I'm going to use the deadly P word, pragmatism. We're willing to make a pragmatic choice and say, we want to do the most good possible in this situation. And if that means voting to elect a pro-choice person who is going to overall advance the pro-life cause, that means doing that. In Alaska, though, in 2010, you had a case where legitimately a guy named Joe Wilson won the Republican primary.
Yeah, he did.
He beat in the primary a sitting pro-choice Republican senator named Lisa Murkowski.
Yep.
When he won, a lot of the pro-lifers were really excited. Lisa Murkowski, even though she's a Republican, she decided instead of picking up her ball and going home and saying, the people have spoken, I'm a member of the Republican Party, I'm going to do what is best for the party, she instead decided to mount a write-in candidacy. And she was the first senator in over 50 years to win election as a write-in candidate. And unfortunately, it's really frustrating to me, and I'm sure to many of the listeners, that when pro-lifers lose in a primary, they're told, sit down, shut up, and support whoever the nominee is, politely. And a lot of times, I think for the greater good of the country and for the greater good of the pro-life movement, pro-lifers do that. But it seems like there's a double standard.
Well, I think there's really two issues here, John, that's going on. One is, has the Republican Party always been prudent and wise in the way they weigh in individual congressional races? And the answer to that question is clearly they haven't always been wise. So there's that prudent issue. But the larger moral question here is this. What does it mean to vote pro-life in most cases? I agree with you completely that there could be individual cases, a possible world where my general rule does not apply. But as you wisely pointed out, we're talking one case out of 400 and some races. So in that case, we have to ask the question, what does it mean in that particular case to vote pro-life? But even if we answer that one a little differently than the other 400 cases, I think the general point I'm making here is you're dealing with parties for the most part. Now, could the math change one day where you had a tremendous influx of Tea Party people, or maybe a new conservative party forms? Let's say the Republicans totally self-destruct. But even there, my principle would still stand. You vote with the party, whether it's the conservative one or the Republican one, that has the best chance of advancing your position right now. Because you can't wait and say, well, why don't we just vote for third candidates all the time? Because maybe then we'll finally purify the Republican Party. You've got what's in front of you right now.
Absolutely.
And you've got to vote in such a way that you advance the good with the situation in front of you right now. I mean, I'm appalled by guys like George Will, who I normally respect, who pens a column last week saying, hey, let's not worry about the president. That race is probably over and lost. Barack Obama's going to get reelected. We'll just work on keeping Congress in play. And then later we can fix all this. Well, don't fix things very easily that get voted into law.
Yeah.
So we want to do the greatest good we can now, today, with the votes in front of us. And I'm saying that as pro-lifers, the idea that the best pro-life vote is to vote for individual candidates while we forget the larger party structure that drives legislation is a colossal mistake on our part.
Now, I would agree with you there. And that's, I think, something that I want to clarify for anyone who's listening. I'm not advocating a policy of saying, oh, well, if there's a pro-life candidate who's got 12% of the vote in the polls, you should vote for them as a protest vote. Yeah. I think you have to be very, again, pragmatic about what you want to do.
And I'd like to define that word pragmatism for a moment, because you didn't do this, and I know what you mean, Jonathan, but there are pro-lifers who draw this distinction between pragmatism on one side and morality on the other.
Right.
The truth is they overlap.
Right.
The pragmatic concern and the moral concern often go hand in hand. Here's where pragmatism is wrong. I don't have an overarching objective moral goal that I'm aiming for. I'm just being pragmatic to be pragmatic.
Right.
So I say, for example, kids will be kids. Let's give young men condoms so that they don't get their girlfriends pregnant. And if they do get them pregnant, well, we've got to have abortion as a backup. Now, some would say that's a pragmatic way of doing it. But that's pragmatism divorced from principle.
Right.
If I say that I'm going to support a party that's pro-life more or less, even though there will be individual members that don't share my view and will be made irrelevant by the majority who do, that could also be termed pragmatism, but it's pragmatism with a moral end in view, the saving of lives. And so pragmatism often gets a dirty label attached to it that you didn't do, but others have done. So I want to be careful that we define what kind of pragmatism we're talking about.
Right. And I was speaking with Josh about this last week, and I think I used the phrase principally pragmatic or pragmatically principled.
That works.
And it's the fact that you do have an ultimate goal in mind. You do have an ultimate moral principle in mind, but you're trying to advance it in the way that is the most successful and the most realistic at the current moment.
Exactly, and the same debate comes down, though it's a little different, on whether it's okay to support incremental legislation. I think we all agree on that one.
Sure.
We are not compromising. We are not being unprincipled. We're working toward a goal to limit the evil done. As much as possible, given the current realities in front of us.
Which is great at absolutism, not incrementalism. Yeah. Okay, so let me ask you a question for both of you. John, my question for you, this is both clarification questions for the audience.
Sure.
Clarification question for John. Do you agree with Scott's general rule to vote party, not person? And Scott, your question for you would be, what do you think about the two outlier cases that John brought up? And if those cases are true exceptions to your rule, where you would agree that those should be exceptions to your rule, what are the factors that can help people identify, is this a general rule thing, or is this one of those crazy exceptions like what John talked about? John, you go first.
I think that as a general matter, of course, I would agree with Scott's rule. I think that there can be cases, obviously, where it's a very specific outlier where you never, in my opinion, the thing I want to just caution people against, and I know you obviously completely support this, is that we never want to have blind allegiance to a letter behind someone's name alone. Especially, in a situation like the Skozafava race. If you were only coming in and your entire amount of civic duty was, well, I heard some guy on a podcast one time say, just vote for the guy with the R or the gal with the R, that would be a poor steward of your civic duty.
Though we welcome any of you that want to do that to do that.
This year.
You can absolutely do that. But I would say in general, yes. I'm just calling people to take it a little step further.
So, and we're going to help people to think more nuanced with that, I think, with Scott's answer to this question. What do you think of these outlier examples, and how can people identify them?
Well, they are just that. They are very narrow exceptions to a very generally true principle that I've laid out here. Look, here's what I think. The Republican Party screwed up in putting Dee Dee in that. And the way they screwed up is they basically brought her in and shoved her into that race and told all the local pro-lifers and Republicans, you will have her as your nominee for this seat. And that offended a lot of people. And this gets back to what I said a moment ago. Is it true that the Republican Party sometimes screws up in the way they foresee political outcomes? Well, no doubt about it. But the general principle would still stand that given Policies are determined by parties at the legislative level. You want to get in line with the party that has the best chance of advancing your agenda, and that party is not the Democrat Party.
Okay, so how could the pro-life people, just a follow-up, how can the pro-life people that were in the areas where those outlier examples were happening, how could they have identified by thinking carefully that this is one of those cases where you don't just vote party? This is an exception to Scott's rule.
Well, I don't think it's a moral exception. I think in this case it was a prudential one,
right.
Politically. Look, the Republican Party screwed up on this. And there were pro-lifers who said, look, we're going with the guy who's running as a conservative, and he will caucus with the Republicans in the House. Everybody knew that was true. But again, the most important vote, let's say that the situation were such that Wilson was only going to get maybe 12% of the vote and we would lose the seat.
Yeah.
It would still be better in that case to vote for the candidate most likely to contribute to the Republican majority in the House, because, again, what's the most important vote Dee Dee is going to cast in her legislative career?
Speaker.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So I could see doing that, and I wouldn't be violating a moral principle
Right.
if I voted for her.
Right.
Now, I will tell you this, emotionally, I would love to vote against her.
Right.
But sometimes I have to swallow what I want for the greater good of saving lives.
Right.
And I agree with Jonathan's point. This isn't about blind allegiance to the Republican Party. If the Republican Party disavows the pro-life principle and begins functioning as a pro-abortion party, I will leave them.
But some people say that's already happened.
No,
and that's
it
why they
hasn't.
vote third party. So answer their problem. They
Well,
say we should vote third party because
it's just
Republican Party,
flat-
they're all rhinos or plinos or whatever.
That's just plain false.
Why?
That is ridiculous false. Well, the evidence tells it. Look at any vote on abortion that's taken place recently. What do you see? Let's just look at the numbers. Where are all these rhinos? Tell me where they are. Now, do they do some things that I don't like? Yes. I don't always agree with what Speaker Boehner's doing. I don't. But you tell me, are they promoting a pro-abortion agenda? No, they're not. And people have said things like, well, the Republicans are no different than Democrats. Give me a break.
Right.
Can we at least be honest about what the realities are?
Well,
in front of
respond
us?
to a slightly more nuanced version of the argument. Some people say, look, let's try to rescue the Republican Party by voting third party in a crucial election. The purification. But I want you to talk more about that, because a lot of people think, hey, they ignore pro-lifers by and large. They keep on putting up the conservative fiscal guy, but who's totally not pro-life, and they'd ignore us in these big numbers. So we're all going to go vote third party once, then they'll take us seriously, and then we'll go Republican after that. Why is that a bad strategy?
Well, number one, that's exactly what Barack Obama and the Democrats want us to do. As soon as
Scott, it worked so well with Perot in '92 and '96.
It worked so well with Perot, didn't it? Yeah, I mean, it was just wonderful. We got Bill Clinton because of Ross Perot. Exactly right. And I think
a lot of people, a lot of listeners, though, if you're not a political junkie like Scott and I, there's something very important. Bill Clinton never won a majority of the vote.
That's right.
A lot of people do not realize he never got above 50% of the vote.
Yeah.
He could not have been the president without Ross Perot.
That's right. Both times. Even Bob Dole would have beaten him without Ross Perot. That's how bad it was. But this idea that we're going to vote to feel good instead of voting to save lives.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And I think people that vote to make a statement, by golly, I'm going to show those Republicans. I'm going to purify them.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, they're content to let a party gain majority status that is committed to killing unborn children wholesale. And I want to say something here. You may choose to edit this out. But some of our Catholic voters need to hear this. Listen, this idea that all issues are morally equivalent and that you're actually casting a pro-life vote when you vote for a so-called social justice candidate who runs as a Democrat who's good on every issue but abortion. No, not all issues are the same, and I'm not going to quote a Protestant source. I'm going to quote Catholic ones. The Pope has drawn a very clear distinction between intrinsic evils and contingent ones. War, capital punishment, respect for the environment, these are contingent moral issues. The killing of unborn humans is an absolute moral evil, and it must be opposed everywhere. If you think you're casting a pro-life vote by voting for Barack Obama or Nancy Pelosi or the Democrat Party, and that somehow constitutes a better pro-life vote, you are gravely mistaken according to your own Pope.
But what about the seamless garment, Scott?
I would like to take the seamless garment and use it on my car to dust off the wax. It's a horrible, horrible way.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that as my own outside the church position. This is what leading Catholic thinkers have said about it. It has justified the killing of millions of unborn children, and it needs to be gotten rid of.
Wow.
I want to just say one more thing, backtracking just a tiny bit. I think that being slightly nuanced, I think there can occasionally be a reason to look at independent candidates in the Senate a little bit more than there can be in the House, because you've seen, for example, in the last few years, the Lisa Murkowski example, the wrong way. But then you saw someone like Joe Lieberman as well, who won as an independent, but unfortunately caucuses with the Democrats.
Of course. He functions as a Democrat.
He does.
Yeah.
And now I think that in some cases, if there is reasonable assumption, there's reason to believe that an independent pro-life candidate has the ability to win, and you're confident that he is going to function as a Democrat,
well, there goes your case. No, I'm kidding.
if he'll function as a Republican,
right.
I think that there can sometimes be a reason to at least look at that. And again, I hate to sound like I'm being wishy-washy, but a lot of times in some of these cases, you have to kind of be willing to, this is going to sound horribly wishy-washy, but you have to be willing to almost blow with the wind in some of these cases to look for the candidate that is the most electable, most pro-life candidate. And in the sense that you want to make sure that I don't think it means voting with a Democrat.
Well, I don't think it's a lot of times that this happens.
I agree.
I would agree with you in principle that there's a possible world where that would be the best pro-life vote. Of course.
Right.
Because everything I'm saying here is contingent on the parties remaining more or less like they are today with their commitments.
Yeah. Can't you just be more dogmatic and less reasonable and agreeable?
No. I enjoy being a hardcore Republican who says everybody's going to burn in hell if they don't vote that way.
Okay, I'm bringing this back. Sounds like then we can answer the ultimate question we started with. Should we always vote for the most pro-life candidate? We can all answer no.
Right.
It's more nuanced than that. Sometimes that means there's a general principle here that we can go from.
We should always vote pro-life.
Absolutely.
There you go.
Absolutely.
But voting pro-life cannot be reduced to a candidate, which is why I did not sign that pledge that went around 10 years ago saying I will never vote for anybody but a pro-life candidate.
Right.
I didn't sign it. It's not a pro-life pledge.
I think the principle that we can agree on instead is the one that Greg Kokel said. We should vote to make a difference, not a statement.
Absolutely.
Scott Klusendorf is the president of Life Training Institute. He's written an awesome book, Case for Life. You should get it. You can buy this. You can also check out their awesome blog and podcast at prolifetraining.com. Jonathan Keller is the executive director of Fresno Right to Life. Thank you both for being on the show.
Thank you.
You've been watching Life Report, Pro-Life Talk, Real World Answers. Life Report is produced by Right to Life of Central California. Visit their website at fresnoprolife.org.